I now like to introduce the moderator, Tim Schlein. This talk is titled The Future of Tech Policy, Balancing Innovation, Security, and Regulations.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be back here at RSA and having the opportunity to talk with you all. And we're going to talk about what I think is one of the more compelling issues that face us right now, sort of some of the high-stake challenges of our time of how to balance innovation, security, and regulation with tech policy. And as we know, technology is evolving at an unprecedented pace, and the policy landscape is kind of scrambling to keep up with all that. AI advancing rapidly, cyber threats more sophisticated than ever, deepfake technology making it harder to tell what's real and what's not. Meanwhile, governments around the world are all trying to figure out how to regulate it all. We're not. Without stifling that innovation and pushing technological leadership elsewhere. So I think the question is, where do you draw the line? What should you do? What shouldn't you do? What are we doing? And how do you make it work in today's world and still stay competitive and make it compete? And super lucky to be joined up here on stage with two tremendous Americans who have done an enormous amount to make this country safe during their careers. Immediately to my left is General Paul Nakasone. General Nakasone was the director of the NSA and commander of U.S. Cyber Command. That's the command that does the offensive cyber for the United States of America. General Nakasone also sits on the board of OpenAI and Witness AI, and has played a tremendous amount in how we think about dealing with foreign adversaries in this country and what to do about it. So we'll dive into some of his experiences. And we also have with us Chris Krebs. Some of you may not have looked at a newspaper sometime in the last week or two. But Chris was the former director of CISA and has played an enormous role in helping to craft and build a lot of policy for this country and how to protect its key critical infrastructure, as well as keeping our elections safe and secure as well along the way, which is one of CISA's roles. And so I couldn't be more pleased to have Chris here and have General Nakasone here with us. And we'll talk about what's going on today, and we're going to talk about maybe what should go on tomorrow. So we're going to try and cover a lot of things, but let me just throw some statistics out to kind of get going. I read the CrowdStrike threat analysis report. I got Kevin Mandia telling me what the Mandiant report's got in it. Basically, China incursions up about 150% year over year. 79% of those are done not using malware. Over 50% of these incursions are taking place in the United States. 200 to 300% increase in breaches towards critical infrastructure pieces of this country that we truly care about. 48 minutes now for breakout times for an incursion. You got Salt Typhoon. We got Vault Typhoon. I've been doing this for 40 years, so I feel like basically a complete and utter failure. What's going on? Like, what needs to, what's your analysis of what the country has been doing? And then we're going to get to what it should be doing that's gotten us to the situation where we don't appear to be winning. Chris, let's get started with you, if I may.
And you've gotten this question too in congressional hearings on cyber. It's like, are we winning or losing? It's not an answerable question. I don't think, at least right now. But to kind of set the stage, as you pointed out, we've been doing this for a while. I've been doing this for a while. I served in the Bush administration, the first Trump go-around, and cyber defensive policy has been a continuous arc since the tail end of the Clinton administration with PPD 58. And it set the framing for how industry and government would work today. Because in the American political tradition, from a policy perspective, we are reactive. We are not following the European policy tradition, which is ready, shoot, aim. We see a lot of regulation towards the tech community that seems to be ahead of the curve, at least for what they're trying to address. Here, let the bad things happen, figure out what we need to address, and then implement policy and implement regulations. Said here in cyber, on the defensive side, it has been how do we work together in an absence of regulation to identify what the greatest harms we're trying to prevent are, and then craft the policies and the frameworks and mechanisms by which we can all work together. So this is since '98 that we've been working on these things. The first ISAC, the Treasury, the financial sector ISAC was set up in the late '90s, early aughts. We've got folks in the room, Mark Sachs, that was part of these policy settings, how we pull people together and work on them. So the problem is, to the question of are we winning or are we losing, is that the adversary gets a vote. They're advancing, they're developing their own capabilities, sometimes in a vacuum, but also sometimes in reaction to the things that we're doing as well. And I don't think it's ever going to be a situation, frankly, from a defensive perspective in the United States, at least under the current approach, that we're ever really going to win. We're always going to be in this kind of back and forth. We're going to be making improvements where we can. But right now, on the cyber defensive front, you have two options, frankly. You have how do we work together collaboratively but voluntarily? And that's where CISA comes into place. CISA is rooted in the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, where industry, the various sectors in industry, come together with the federal government, figure out what they're trying to do and accomplish, what the federal government can bring to the fight, which tends to be declassified information out of the intelligence community that we bring in and deliver to our partners in industry, and industry then shares back with us, hey, here's what we're worried about, here's where we're getting hit. And then you can make adjustments along the way. Then you have the regulatory side that has been very targeted, very narrowly tailored. CISA has, at the current moment, one not even active in-flight regulation. And the one that they do have is on incident notification. We still have a few months, I think, till that comes out. I suspect it'll be challenged, particularly there's another panel going on right now about the regulation in the post-Chevron world. So after a Supreme Court decision last year, I think we're probably going to see a little bit of pullback on CISA's authorities, but CISA's really there as a trusted partner. And I think the moment that we're in right now is what worries me the most, is trust arrives on foot, leaves on horseback. It takes years to do this.
So I think I would take a step back. Let's talk about the adversaries. This is where I would say the first thing from your statistics, I think we are seeing a tremendous separation between China and everyone else. Scope, scale, sophistication of what China is doing today really dwarfs Russia, Iran, North Korea, anything that we have seen before. So I begin with that piece of it. And I think that the second piece I would add, and I think Chris would also talk about, is the fact that this is just an incredibly dynamic environment right now, right? And as we make one advancement, we'll make 2 steps forward and maybe 1 step back. And so I think that becomes with this idea of how do we stay persistently engaged with our adversaries? Because you can't just have one regulation and hope that that's going to do it, or one cure and you're done. This is something every single day. We have to set the boundaries in terms of what our adversaries try to do that we should be doing. This is the whole idea of defensively, offensively, whatever you're going to do, make sure that your adversary knows that you are playing in cyberspace every day. And the third thing is, I think that from the statistics that you read, Ted, and Ted, you didn't even talk about ransomware. 15% increase in ransomware last year. We need different partnerships. We need to figure out how the partnerships are going to come together and how we're going to synchronize a better action against these adversaries.
So I want to get to offense in a second, because there's a lot of talk right now about being more aggressive on the offensive front, and I'm curious on your takes on that. But I want to get back to, Chris, you alluded to, you sort of said today we're not set up right. And so I want to kind of pull on that thread. Is there something that you would change in order to try and get a better defensive posture in the country? Where, the reality is Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon have happened. They exist. There's not that much going on to fix it. And so what would you change?
So let's split out the two, right? The one that worries me the most is Volt Typhoon. Volt Typhoon is the Chinese military, the PLA, that has been found not just in military critical infrastructure, but domestic civilian critical infrastructure, pre-positioning for what? Likely kinetic action by the Chinese, Taiwan, elsewhere. They hit us here first. They take us out of the fight. The problem that we're seeing is that they're not hitting, or they're not necessarily targeting strategic assets. They're going after civilian stuff with the intent to create panic, chaos, and I would posit to kill people. To really create a situation environment here in the US where political leadership has to address that rather than going and projecting force elsewhere.
So is there policy that could correct for that?
So you're talking about local water facilities,
I know.
municipal power plants. Is there a policy that could address that? Sure. You implement some sort of regulatory program that requires a baseline level of cybersecurity. Who's going to pay for that? Who's going to monitor that? Who's going to enforce that? Who's actually going to implement that? When you talk about IT security at a municipal water facility, it does not exist. We talk about shortages of workforce in the federal government that pays pretty well. Statistics got 400,000 some odd openings, whatever the number. It's not 400,000, it's 400. But across the country, there's 1 million plus openings.
Right.
So
Where is this gonna go?
I think again, this idea of how do we think of a new future in which we're providing services by our government to different elements, 16 different elements of critical infrastructure, and some are obviously better financed than others. We know that we've been and worked with a number of them. But for water or for others, why are we not providing scanning, or why are we not providing protective DNS, or why are we not providing different things that will raise the bar? Interestingly enough, Ted, you didn't say that they're using many of their 0 days, right? So it's very easy right now to establish a presence, move laterally, and then capture the network.
I'd say 79% are all done without malware. So that, basically they're getting credentials and they're living off the land, right? That seems to be what's happened to that, which is unbelievably difficult to remove. So
I agree with Paul, 100%, that we need to provide resources to the underfunded, the under-resources. Problem is we've done that. Multi-state ISAC, the election infrastructure ISAC.
Right.
Those things have been gutted. So what are we going to do going forward? That's what I just don't see the path here. If we're not going to go the regulatory route, which we can't, the voluntary side hasn't really proven out to deliver the successes that we had hoped over the last decade plus. Federal government is pulling back investments across the board. So I agree that we need to provide more of these
do you think
capabilities.
there's an opportunity to maybe provide a carrot to incent? I've often talked about, for lack of creativity, I called it the Hygiene Act, but that if there's a certain minimum cyber bar and you hit it, and you can do it by sector, that you have a safe harbor against all future lawsuits. You can't, the SEC can't do anything, the FTC can't do anything, you can't have class action lawsuits brought against you. Would something like that work to try and get these sectors to increase their level of cyber readiness, or they just don't even have the
So I think that part of it, and just to kind of to capture a bit what Chris was saying, I think part of it is that you have to have a strategy. You have to have a campaign plan. You have to have a way to bring a number of different entities together, whether or not it's the carrot or it's the stick, or whether or not it's the private sector, or whether or not it's academia. Someone has to orchestrate this to be able to say, hey, we're going to make sure that our critical infrastructure, particularly that critical infrastructure that we are so dependent upon for our national security, it has to be synchronized in terms of how we're going to look at a different way of securing it.
So we need leadership. Okay, I got that. Can I move to a little bit on offense?
Yeah, but real quick on that point, I mean, that's absolutely right. I think one of the challenges we see, though, is that all sectors aren't created equal.
Yeah.
Right? The financial services sector is loaded. Right. They do well. They spend a tremendous amount, very, very resilient. It's not like that across the board, right? We've talked about electricity. We've talked about water. Healthcare. Getting crushed.
Yeah.
Right? That's where I think it would be a really ripe area for looking at what these incentives are. Unfortunately, I think from a policy perspective, the default is how do we give them more money? Because that solves the immediate problem.
Right. They got to know what to do with the money. So I assume you saw the power outage in Europe. you know, I guess because we always talk about trying to interconnect our grid here in this country. They have a highly integrated grid over there, and you saw the movie Zero Day
Right.
kind of taking place over in Europe. Now it hasn't been attributed to a cyber attack, but the fact that they dismissed it being a cyber attack so quickly makes me a little suspect.
What was it, Mark? Advanced persistent squirrel, right? Probably.
That's
Yeah.
An APS? Is it an APS? All right.
Yeah, but I think that, Ted, your point, it's, perhaps this is an opportunity for all of us to kind of take a step back to say,
Yeah.
okay, so where's our resiliency, right, when this
Yeah.
happens? And what happens when, we see this across multiple cities, or when, the FAA's picture goes down? What's that mean to us? And how are we going to be able to figure that out? It gets back, I think, to this point of, how do we have the campaign plan that's actually
Right.
going to take care not only of the malware and the intrusions that we have today, but also kind of thinks our way through what type of resiliency do we need as a
Yeah.
nation? How are we going to be able to think about, who's going to be the spokesperson for this? Who's going to get up and actually, we used to have this conversation, like, when there's attack on the nation, Chris Krebs is going to go ahead and speak because he's with CISA and I'm NSA. So
There you go. You're right
How did
behind
that
him, right
work
behind
out
him.
for me, Paul? And it has to be future-proof too, right? Because every day we're connecting more and more things. Every aspect of
Yeah.
our lives on a daily basis becomes more interconnected, more dependent on technology. I also am not quite sure that as a government, we're organized for the modern digital society. Even from delivering internal services within the USG, we don't have an effective shared services model.
Right.
We have to get there.
Right. Each agency's, kind of builds its own tech stacks, which is, I think, crazy.
Yeah. I mean, the very first thing, just there, I'm blowing your script here, but mail, just mail alone, a centrally provisioned, deployed, managed, monitored mail service for civilian government is table stakes. It would save billions in M365 licenses alone on an annual basis for the government. Start there.
Hopefully no one from Microsoft's in the room, but
Only one government agency, civilian agency, uses Gmail, the GSA. Everything else is M365.
all right. I'm gonna. In 2018, General, you changed kind of the attack profile. Maybe that's the wrong word, of the country. And I'm kind of wondering, you started going down a persistent engagement, which you talked a lot about back then. What took place in the country that enabled you to at least describe for everyone the changes you made? But was there a policy change? Was it a dogma change? What was it that allowed you to lean forward and be more aggressive?
coming out of the confirmation hearings in the spring of 2018, I was, very focused on making sure that we were able to deliver a safe and secure election for the midterms in 2018. That was backed up also with a strategy that the department came out and said, we're going to defend forward in cyberspace. So we're going to operate outside the United States, ensure our adversaries understand that whatever they're trying to do in terms of influence or interference or anything like that, we're going to take them on. And that then was backed up by policy and authorities. So the policy came with the policy that the White House drove during the first Trump administration to look at how we use our offensive capabilities differently. And the authorities came from Congress in the National Defense Authorization Act of 2019 that said, hey, DoD, you can operate outside of your networks. Cyber is a traditional military activity. Those were very key pieces that then started us along this path of, hey, why don't we go ahead and send teams to other countries to operate on their networks to see what our adversaries might be doing in terms of, a little bit of canary in the coal mine, and then taking that back, and then instead of bringing all the data back to Fort Meade, let's share it with the private sector. And let's allow a consortium of cybersecurity companies to identify the malware, develop signatures, and also develop antidotes for it. It was fantastic. Here's what we learned. Our adversaries see us. And when we started to work and continue to take them on, I felt as though we were able to drive a level of, concern, deterrence, or whatever it is on the part of our adversaries that was different. And we were very forward-leaning, saying, hey, we're not going to sit and take it anymore. We are going to make sure that you understand that we're going to operate in this space. And if you're doing things that are against the interests of our nation or our allies, we're going to take you on.
And take you on means,
Take you on in sense of being able to, first of all, identify you, take you on in terms of releasing information, take you on in terms of being able to, take down your infrastructure if authorized. I mean, there was a whole, a whole rheostat of things that we said, these are the things that we're going to go after.
And that flow from offense to defense was also happening at the strategic level. So where those defend forward teams were in countries in Europe that were getting hit by Russia, we could provide some taskings and say, hey, what's happening in the election infrastructure over there? And so they say, oh, hey, the Russians in this country are going after election night reporting and voter reg.
First place we sent a team to was Ukraine.
Yeah.
It was amazing. It was like, and then suddenly, DHS and system was able to do to pile on this really was, it was 1 + 1 = 2. It was a multiple of that. And I think that's where, this is coming back, Ted, to this idea of if you have a strategy of a series of different actions, if you're continuing to move in this space, there's a dynamic force that you can create too.
so would you take that set of programs and put it on steroids in some way? Like, how would you bring us forward? Like, if you were still there, what would you do with that program? How would you make us more persistent or more aggressive or not? I mean, I don't.
So I think if I was still the commander of U.S. Cyber Command, my sense would be I'd prioritize the adversaries that we need to go after, and then begin with the Chinese. Okay, this is the pacing challenge for the nation. This is what we have to go after. They're in our critical infrastructure. They're in a series of 9 different telcos. We are going to make sure that they understand that this type of behavior is not going to be handled. And then I think the other thing is bringing a
By the
series
way,
of
that's code for what?
That's code for everything from we're going to hunt in different networks to find you and expose you. It's code for we're going to create a series of information operations. It's code for working with the private sector to make sure that they understood when they saw different anomalies that they would report it and we report back to them. And I think it's also code for, hey, if necessary, we're going to take offensive action against you. And I think that whole scale of different activities gives you a lot of different options.
Right.
So the way I look at it is, the future is now, but the future of modern conflict starts in cyberspace. So we're going to need more resources, more personnel, more automation, of course. But I think going forward, you pile more resources on this, more people, and it's more active space. It's only going to get more active. I mean, this is like the neuromancer moment. William Gibson had it nailed, right? Everything going forward is unthinkably complex. Everything's happening in cyberspace. The second piece is defense can inform offense as well. Defense is not always in the receiving mode. So one of the things that we saw in the 2020 election, and General Hartman talked about this, I think at Black Hat last year or 2 years ago, is we were seeing incomings trying to exploit vulnerabilities on a election system, pass that back up the chain for action. Again, the seamless flow from offense to defense and the defense back to offense, that is how it should work. So you want to talk about piling more resources on and putting more emphasis on bang, 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 we can go hit the bad guys in real time.
It begins with the foundation of a great defense, though. I mean, it's like, NSA, it's all about encryption, right? We're going to make sure that our data, our networks, our weapon systems, tier 1 encryption, okay? And then it's the same thing as we take a look at our critical infrastructure. I think that's where we've got to say, okay, where do we need to focus our efforts?
So then, correct me if I'm wrong, if we want to go take a more aggressive offensive posture, and the typhoons are among us, it wouldn't say that our defense is really in the best of shape to go create more offense. Because just make the assumption if we push somebody, they're going to push back harder. So don't we have to get the defense right before we get more offensive? Or
I think we have to do both. I think that this is a piece where you have to raise the level of, you have to raise the bar, so you're not going to have 79% using creds coming into your critical infrastructure, but at the same time, you have to operate all the time so your adversaries understand that, hey, we know you're there. We're going to find you, and we're going to take action.
All right. Chris, could you ever see a way to leverage the private sector on the offensive side of this equation? We talk, because most of what the generals talked about is the use of how Cyber Command and NSA are so well.
You're
integrated.
going there.
So-
Oh my
so-
God.
So there wasn't a.
So,
Yeah, I didn't make
look, I mean, I'm not going to speak to what happens in the DoD with contractors and things like that, but I think really what you're, like, where does this inevitably end, right? And I think one of the arguments, it's been going around, particularly Capitol Hill, for a decade or more now, but this concept of, we'll just kind of cut to it, but the cyber letters of marque, right? That enables private sector hackback, which I think, given the conditions in place right now in industry, given the legal frameworks that we have in place in the United States, I don't think it's a good idea. I think enabling the private sector to go out and touch someone else in another country is going to put a lot of alliances at risk. What if one of the Volt Typhoon actors is sitting on a pivot point in Germany? What do we do? What does that private sector company do? Go hit a server, a data center in Germany? Like, where does that take us? It really needs to be carefully thought through what the risks are, what the mitigations are, what the rules of the road are. And I just don't think from a policy perspective, we have the know-how, we have the sophistication in place yet. Is it possible down the road? Likely. I think, in fact, it's probably inevitable down the road, but not right now.
So I'm not sure on that. I'm not sure on that. My concern always is to conduct these operations, you have to synchronize them.
Yeah.
So who's going to do the synchronization with the privates, and who are you going to talk to? Chris identified one of the great risks here is, what are you going after? And are you sure that you've attributed that correctly?
Yeah.
Is your intelligence really that good that
Yeah.
you're able to identify this as an adversary and you're comfortable that we're going to take action, maybe even in a friendly country? Those are really difficult questions. And so coming back to that, my experience has been is that the synchronization part combined with the really good intelligence, with the application of force that could be even deadly force, that's something that our government does. That's something that the DoD does.
Yeah.
And so,
Right. I mean, it's the brilliance of NSA and Cyber Command being so integrated, because you need all that surveillance to do a proper offensive.
it is
So-
really, really challenging in terms of, first of all, being able to attribute the actor, and then being able to truly understand, is this really the actor there?
That was very subtle, Ted, by the way.
Oh, I'm as subtle as they come, Chris. You know that. By the way, I looked up when the last letter of marque was given out. It was to
Jefferson.
Goodyear, for the Goodyear blimp to go hunt Japanese subs during World War II. Just a little trivia piece on letters of marque. But I think I'm right on that. So if I can, let's move on to, let's do some AI talk.
Sure.
Let's get into the AI and the role policy should or shouldn't play. Like we got executive orders saying we're going to do stuff. We got executive orders saying we're not going to do stuff. Right now we're in the not going to do anything phase. General, you're on the board of OpenAI. I'm kind of curious as to just and because of your background. Do you think we need some sort of regulatory guardrails or policy around AI? And if so, what would it be?
So our focus obviously has been on a preparedness framework as we take a look at the release of our models, and this is something I think that OpenAI has done a very, very good job at, in being able to bring both the safety and the security element to bear on what's going on. I think the piece that we need within our government right now is the strategy that really underlies how are we going to be able to not only take this innovation, but also to implementation. How are we going to have the resources with regards to chips, data, energy, and talent that's going to be necessary for us to move forward. We are at a point right now as we see ourselves, and I think that is generally recognized, that the United States leads in this, this incredibly important technology for the future. But that's not guaranteed. And I think where our focus needs to be is how do we ensure that lead continues not only to diminish but to grow.
But that's the forward-leaning, let's not lose our competitive edge. Chris, do you see that, AI could actually cause more damage than, and therefore somehow we got to put some guardrails around it and somehow, and people are talking about, data you can train on, data you can't train on, something around the models, something around, what prompts are allowed, what prompts are allowed. I'm just kind of.
So that's been, to date, the European model. That's been the Indian model, the Chinese model, to get in there and again, be very proactive in what you can use the models for, what sectors specifically, what decision-making processes, particularly as it comes to critical infrastructure. Here, I actually didn't think the Biden administration EO on AI was terribly restrictive.
It's really just on the foundational model, guys.
Yeah, it was, hey, you cross a certain threshold in computation, you just have to report to the government that you've run a red team and just make the report. So that's a very simplified version, but nonetheless, I thought it was fairly reasonable. Beyond that, yeah, I think we need to have conversations about how AI is used for certain financial decisions, healthcare decisions, housing decisions. I think that's okay to at least be in play for the policy discussions. Whether we're saying yes or no right now, I think that's different. But let's figure out what the harms that we're trying to avoid are, and start putting in place some guardrails there.
And so if I mix that with, General, your view of how do we stay aggressive and make sure we win in the long run, and our main competitor doesn't actually care about anything you just said, Chris.
Yeah.
Can both things survive? Can we win in the long run and still put some guardrails?
I think we can.
Yeah. We have to.
We have to. I mean, it's like, it's not a question here, I think. I think that's what we have to be able to do this.
Okay. So you don't, let's pick at a different aspect of this.
But
think about our own cyber policies in this country as to where we would, by the way, it's not like I disagree with them around what we're willing to pre-position into and what we're not willing to pre-position into and why that is. As a country, our adversaries don't think necessarily the same way. And does that put us at a disadvantage from a democratic
But this
principle
is the
standpoint,
tension of capitalism and democracy.
Yep.
And there's going to be an ebb and a flow here, but we are not an authoritarian state that is ruled by law. That is what China can do, and they will do it. We do not do it that way here. So do we have to win through this? Yes. How we do it is the question. And I am not convinced yet that we have the tech policy know-how and the wherewithal to get us through this fight. We're working towards it, but the Congress, this is really complicated stuff.
Yes, it is.
And I'm not sure we have what we need to put the right guardrails in place. And instead, we may over-rotate, we may under-rotate. Like, how do we chart the path through it?
Okay. So, Chris, you brought up something earlier about international regs and everything. And in Europe, they have the Digital Markets Act and they have the Digital Service Act, which
And the AI Act and the Cyber Resilience Act.
And
yeah.
by the way, they all apply to
GDPR.
the same internet that we all use. How do you work in this world where people, users, just be treated different in different geographic areas? Do these policies end up bifurcating the internet into these different ways that are untenable ultimately? Or do you need a consistent set of policy across it all? Does it matter or not?
Well, first off, that's never going to happen. Ever. Harmonization of tech policy, I think it is not a top priority for national capitals. And it's certainly not going to happen when you're talking about authoritarian states. Trying to get some sort of regulatory harmonization with China, don't even start. So everybody knows TikTok, right? There's a version in China. Guess what? A member, if you're a user of TikTok, you cannot friend the exact same damn thing in China, just goes by a different name but runs on different tech stack. Facebook, Meta, whatever we're calling it, you can't. So you can have an Instagram friend that's in Europe, right? The danger, I think, in the direction we may be going is that division of the tech stack where you're running on European metal with perhaps US tech company cloud software, and then whatever app sits on top, is there going to be a restriction because maybe the Europeans don't think, or Max Schrems sues again, and doesn't think that the data privacy framework that is in place right now and was agreed to under the Biden administration, they don't think that's robust enough to protect the privacy of European citizens. So now we've got, boom, split down the middle, social media networks are over here, or it's not even that. What about just productivity? So your Workday, your Salesforce, whatever. Like those things now, due to the lack of trust, transatlantic, that could happen down the road, now creates a cleaving between the technology that we're using and that multinational companies use on a regular basis. I think that is potentially where we're going, particularly right now in this moment where Europe is looking at an opportunity they have to invest and create European champions in the technology space.
But there's a risk in that too, right? They could necessarily not have the size that they need with these European companies.
Yes, yeah,
And so this is the challenge, right? You're taking a gamble here.
of course.
Europe, right?
But at the same time, there's that trust element. Do they have the confidence and the trust they need into what they're given from U.S. companies?
I'm going to rewind for a second because General, you talked about, we have to win in the world of AI. We got to win in the world of AI. Should there be some sort of national industrial policy around AI where you're lining up the university systems, if they still exist? You're lining up the private sector. You kind of line up each avenue of the economy and the U.S. apparatus to win. So you want the chips. You want kind of all. You
Want the energy. You want
energy and everything. So that it's a heavy lift. It's a big deal. I mean, you think about just getting the CHIPS Act done, which is a version of industrial policy. Could you see an industrial policy approach to AI?
I think it's that important. I think it's that important. I think that, my recollection was, of course, the space, program in terms of how we started to mobilize our country to be able to, send a man to the moon and safely return to Earth. This is much more difficult in many ways in terms of how you bring together both the private and the public sector. But, I think for each of those four things, Ted, between chips and data and and energy and talent. I mean, this is the piece that we think about today in terms of how are we going to be able to ensure that we have the talent necessary for the future, and how do we encourage that across many different secondary and university systems. That's our near-term piece. The other things we will get. It's the talent piece that I think a lot about.
Tech industrial policy is something that made, I think, everyone inside the Beltway kind of give them the heebie-jeebies 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But I think with certainly the beginning of the last Trump administration, when we really had a focus on 5G and what the alternative Huawei looks like.
Yep.
That, I think, kind of broke the ice, and now we're having these broader conversations. The CHIPS and Science Act has moved the needle.
Yeah.
We are seeing investments here. We're seeing other investments in the United States right now in other parts of critical minerals now, or critical sectors. But are we going to go so far as to pull together the equivalent of a Made in China 2025 strategy, identifying the top 10 priority sectors? I don't think we're going to go there because I don't think we can plan that far out. So instead, it's going to be pick the top 4 or 5 or whatever, put the resources behind it, and go execute.
All right.
But I think that piece, right? When you said that, that's a big step forward for us. In terms of what we're doing right now, as opposed to just looking at it and saying, well, maybe we'll get it together, as opposed to, hey, let's.
Well, it'd be a major undertaking. I mean,
But that's what our government does, right? These are major things that when we take a look at competitive advantage, this is a competitive advantage to synchronize industrial policy for the nation. I think this is like one of those key things that we have to have.
So you're right, this is what our government does, but it does it really well in only certain spaces. And the military does strategy and campaign planning exceptionally well. There are other parts of the civilian government that I don't think do it quite as well, certainly not in an integrated manner with the other core components of the federal government. I think that's what we need more of.
Right, when you take, as Ted mentioned, the CHIPS, to see commerce now kind of lean in, right? And as we got the CHIPS Act going, you know, it's good to see different parts of commerce I never even knew existed, or like, you know, and talking about, you know, what's the intel out there and what do they need. But I think you're right, Chris. This is the element. What are the other commerce-like entities that we need for this?
I'm going to switch modes again just to see if we can cover a large enough swath of topics here. Software liability. So another kind of hot topic, whether it's you know, secure by design. It was a concept. I've probably given talks on this for almost 30 years about how the entire software industry grew up with really no liability associated with it. You could build it, sell it to customers, and then the software companies would charge the customer about 17% a year to ship them patches every year to fix the mistakes, and they would update it, and life goes on and on. The question really is should that remain? Should the technology providers be held liable for security flaws, is essentially how it's being proposed, or bugs, if you will, in their technology? Is that realistic? Would it be helpful? Can you see a different version of that? That might be helpful. Just, Chris?
I'm going to give you an entirely unsatisfying answer.
Oh, great. Thank you.
It kind of like has to be, because everything's software now. Every company out there is a software company. Everybody's got engineers in-house doing internal apps or whatever customer-facing apps. Just the amount of code. So we do need to pivot towards something that's more sustainable, that's more defensible. However, there is no other product space that I'm aware of, at least, I could be completely wrong about this, but at least where I'm aware of, that you have an intelligent adversary that is every second of every day picking apart that product, looking to exploit it for, in some cases, destruction at one side, espionage and crime at the other. So it is just from the foundational pieces, really, really complicated. I think where we're going, at least again by the Biden administration setting up the software liability framework, or at least getting a team of lawyers together, but of course such a thing in DC takes 5-10 years. But that might be how long it takes to get something together that actually works and that can hold up to challenges and scrutiny. But in the meantime, we're relying on civil courts, negligence claims, to kind of vet this out. And that's not efficient at all.
But I would say the first part of your answer was it's unrealistic, actually, to hold these guys to, just because of what the adversaries are doing. It just might, lawyers might benefit, but I'm not so sure the world's going to be safer, sort of thing.
I guess what I would say, I'm not going to go on the path to regulation, but what I am going to go to the path is there has to be greater transparency on some of this. This is one of the things that I do think has to come back is Cyber Safety Review Board. This was, now that it has been, taken off, it needs to come back in another form, and we need to have that type of oversight, particularly as we take a look at so much of our software being responded for, critical pieces of what our national security is, and being done by very, very small handful of actual companies out there.
So I agree. The Cyber Security Review Board was pretty awesome, I thought. It's shining a light on what the problem was, the root problem. The question is, should that then yield liability? Like, should now I'm making an assumption, the broad assumption that the vendor didn't mean to do it. The vendor didn't mean to not use a secure development lifecycle, and they didn't mean to ship software that had vulnerabilities in it that got exploited. And maybe you want to argue that point, but let's just, should they then still be held liable when something shows, hey, you actually missed this?
Well, who's to say that it won't? I mean, Congress had hearings, at least on the Exchange Online report. At least the House did. The Senate said they were going to. They haven't done it yet. They probably won't, but nonetheless, there was additional oversight. Does that go anywhere? I don't know. But look, in the meantime of that, I think that initiatives, you mentioned Secure by Design, you mentioned transparency. I thought that was a great initiative. And we may see that too go away. And I think that's a real shame. I think that the Secure by Design initiative was a great way to pull companies together and actually kind of pulled on the corporate responsibility strings. It's like, what are your responsibilities here? Absence a regulator with a boot on your neck. How do we do this in a responsible, transparent way? I think it generated better outcomes. I also think that having a bunch of vulns creates better outcomes. I mean, there are plenty of organizations that have, over the last 5 years, have had a series of vulnerabilities that have been exploited by the Chinese and others that have completely revamped their code base as a result. I think these are good things. Just can we continue to iterate forward and do better and do better and do better?
All right, we're going to be running out of time here shortly. Should the main platforms, in particular GCP, Azure, AWS, be regulated?
They already are.
Like,
You go ask
really,
them.
I mean, just like a.
Are you talking directly?
Yeah, just
Well, they already are.
Just like water, electric, similar kinds of regulatory bodies.
So you're saying is cloud a utility? I think that's the conversation. Is cloud becoming, or has it established itself effectively as a utility? I think there are those at some of those hyperscalers that in 2015, having been at a hyperscaler in 2015, that would have said, yes, absolutely, we are that. And again, regulation is inevitable. We need to start positioning for that. And almost
it begins
every
with transparency, though, right? It begins with a degree of transparency that we're able to see, we're able to identify that that when mistakes are made, they are not hidden, that they are actually being.
So that also speaks to the CSRB. What happens next? Does it need to be authorized by Congress? Does it need to be a set-aside body? Does it need to have subpoena authority like the NTSB? I'd argue yes, because as soon as you start having consequences beyond just bad pub from some of these reports, and you actually have oversight with liability, and it's a voluntary participation model, that transparency disappears. So I think you've got to have, you talk about incentives, there are carrots, there are sticks. I think you got to have both.
Got it. Last word from each of you. If you could wave your magic wand and create any particular policy you think that would actually matter, what would you create, General?
Industrial policy with regards to AI. We come back to the discussion we have. How do we make sure that we are on the pathway not only to maintain the lead, but increase that lead as we take a look at the most disruptive technology today and into the future?
I'm not going to give anything nearly as eloquent as that. I think Jen Easterly did a great job last week with a LinkedIn post on kind of the moment we are in right now with cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is national security. We all know that, right? That's why we're here. That's why we get up every morning and do our jobs. We are protecting everyone out there. And right now, to see what's happening to the cybersecurity community inside the federal government, we should be outraged. Absolutely outraged. And look, I can say that as the director of CISA. I can be pissed off that CISA is getting cut back and all that. And I can see the policy arguments for trying to downsize government, streamline. But when you've got Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon, whatever, every day knocking on our door, we are not moving forward. We have to continue moving forward. We need more Cyber Command warfighters. We need more folks at the NSA collecting intel. We need more frontline defenders, threat hunters, red teamers, folks that are just doing sysadmin, the basics. We need more of that, not less. So that's my pitch. Make CISA great again.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed the conversation we had up here. We tried to cover a large swath. As Chris very eloquently and passionately put out there, cybersecurity is national security. This is just too important for the future of this country, for the future of our economy. Economic security is also national security, and these things are all interlinked. And so we need great leadership to help guide us through all this. And I was lucky enough to share the stage with two wonderful leaders for this country. And so please join me in thanking them for their time.